The train whistle screamed through the New Mexico territory like a dying animal, and Natalie Vaughn pressed her forehead against the rattling window, watching her old life disappear into dust and distance with every mile that carried her toward a man she had never met. The advertisement had been clear enough when she found it crumpled on the floor of the boarding house where she worked 16 hours a day for barely enough to keep herself fed. Seeking bride for ranch in Santa Fe territory. Previous arrangement fell through. Immediate departure required. The words had been practical, businesslike, and Natalie had responded the same way because practicality was all she had left after her parents died of influenza, and the bank took everything they owned. She was 22 years old, alone in Philadelphia, and running out of options that did not involve selling more than her labor. The other women in her train car whispered behind their hands when they thought she could not hear. Replacement bride. Second choice. The words stung like alkali dust in an open wound. But Natalie kept her chin up and her eyes forward because she had learned years ago that pride was sometimes all a person had to keep them from breaking entirely. The landscape outside transformed as they pushed west through the territories. The green of the eastern states gave way to endless plains, then to something wilder and more severe. By the time they reached New Mexico in late May of 1878, the earth had turned red and gold, scattered with sage and pinyon pine, and the sky stretched so vast and blue it made Natalie's chest ache with something she could not name. The air through the open windows tasted different here, sharper and cleaner, carrying the scent of juniper and dust and possibility. Santa Fe Station was smaller than she expected, a rough wooden structure that looked like a strong wind might carry it away. Natalie gathered her 2 carpet bags, everything she owned in the world, and stepped onto the platform with her heart hammering against her ribs. The sun hit her like a physical force, hotter and more direct than anything she had known back east, and she had to squint against the brilliance of it. A man stood at the far end of the platform, tall and lean in dusty work clothes, a worn hat pulled low over his face. He was not looking at the train or the passengers disembarking. Instead, he was staring at something in the distance, his shoulders rigid with what looked like reluctance or maybe resignation. Natalie knew with sudden certainty that this was Kieran Cole, her intended husband, and he looked about as enthusiastic to be there as a man facing the gallows. She made herself walk toward him, her practical gray traveling dress already sticking to her back with sweat. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 27 or 28, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of winter grass. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome if it were not set in such hard lines, and there was a scar along his jaw that spoke of violence survived. "Mr. Cole." Her voice came out steady, which was a small victory. He turned to look at her finally, and something flickered across his face too quickly for her to read. "Miss Vaughn." It was not a question. He did not offer his hand or smile or give any indication that he was pleased to meet her. "Your trunk coming on a later train. This is everything." She indicated her bags. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You travel light. I do not have much." There was no point in pretending otherwise. He picked up both bags as if they weighed nothing, which they nearly did. "Wagon is this way." He started walking without checking to see if she followed, and Natalie had to hurry to keep up with his long strides. The wagon was exactly what she expected, functional and worn, pulled by 2 horses that looked better cared for than the vehicle itself. Kieran loaded her bags into the back and then stood there for a moment, looking at the wagon seat as if he had just realized something he did not like. "I suppose I should say something about this situation." His voice was rough, unused to complicated conversations. "You do not need to explain." Natalie did not want his explanations or his pity. She wanted to get through this with whatever dignity she had left. The woman before you, her name was Catherine. She was my brother's girl first. The words came out flat, factual. My brother Michael died last winter. Horse threw him and he broke his neck. Catherine and we figured maybe we could make something work, since the ranch needs a woman and she needed security. But she met someone else, a banker up in Albuquerque, and I do not blame her for choosing a better situation. Natalie absorbed this information, understanding now why the advertisement had been so abrupt. I am sorry about your brother. That makes one of us. The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Before Natalie could respond, he was boosting her up onto the wagon seat with hands that were careful but impersonal, as if she were a sack of grain that needed loading. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they rolled out of Santa Fe without another word. The ranch was an hour outside of town, following a road that was barely more than wagon ruts through the scrubland. The silence between them stretched taut and uncomfortable, filled only with the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves. Natalie tried to think of something to say that would not sound foolish or desperate, but everything that came to mind felt wrong. You know what people are going to say. Kieran spoke suddenly, not looking at her. That you are second choice, that I am settling, that this whole thing is a mistake. I know what people say about a lot of things. Natalie kept her voice level. I have learned that their opinions do not put food on the table or a roof over my head. He glanced at her then, really looked at her for the first time, and she met his eyes steadily. You are practical. I am a survivor. Something in his expression shifted, softened just slightly at the edges. I suppose we are both that. The ranch appeared in the distance, a low adobe house with a wooden barn and several outbuildings scattered across land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Cattle dotted the landscape, dark shapes against the red earth, and the whole spread had an air of being well tended but lonely, as if it were waiting for something more than just the work that kept it running. Kieran pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and sat there for a moment, his hands still on the reins. I should tell you something before we go in, before we do this properly. Natalie waited, her stomach tight with sudden anxiety. I do not love you. His voice was quiet but clear. I do not even know you, and I am not going to pretend that this is some romantic story where everything works out neat and pretty. The words should have hurt, but they did not. They were too honest for that. I did not expect romance, Mr. Cole. I expected a partnership. A chance at something better than what I was leaving behind. Kieran. He turned to face her fully. If we are going to be married, you should call me Kieran. Natalie, she replied. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two strangers about to tie their lives together for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and everything to do with necessity. Then Kieran climbed down and came around to help her from the wagon, and his hands on her waist were warm and solid and surprisingly gentle. The house was simple inside. One large main room with a kitchen area, a table, a few chairs, and a fireplace. Two doors led to what Natalie assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean but sparse, functional in the way of a place where no one had bothered to make it a home. Your room. Kieran indicated the door on the left and carried her bags inside. Natalie followed and found a small space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the empty land. He set her bags down and then stood there awkwardly, as if he were not sure what came next. We will ride into town tomorrow to see the priest. Father Martinez has been expecting us. All right. You must be tired. I will fix something for supper. He left before she could respond, and Natalie sank down onto the bed, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than just the long journey. She had done it. She had crossed half a continent to marry a stranger who had just told her plainly that he did not love her. And she did not even have the luxury of being hurt by that, because it was exactly what she had signed up for. The wedding happened the next afternoon in Santa Fe's small adobe church, with Father Martinez speaking the words in both English and Spanish, while Natalie and Kieran stood side by side and promised things they had no idea if they could keep. Kieran had cleaned up for the occasion, shaved and wearing what was clearly his best shirt, though he still looked uncomfortable in his own skin. Natalie wore the only dress she owned that was not gray or brown, a simple blue cotton that had been her mother's, and she tried not to think about how different this was from the wedding she had imagined as a girl. 2 ranch hands from a neighboring property served as witnesses, men named Frank and Roberto, who clearly knew Kieran well enough to be curious about his sudden bride. They were polite but watchful, and Natalie understood that she would be judged by everyone in this territory, measured against the woman she had replaced. When Father Martinez pronounced them married, Kieran leaned in and kissed her briefly on the cheek, a gesture so formal and passionless that it might have been a handshake. Then it was done, and Natalie was a wife, though she did not feel materially different from the way she had felt that morning. They had dinner at the town's hotel, a meal that Kieran insisted on despite Natalie's protests about the expense. It was the first time she had eaten anything that could be called fancy in months, roast beef and potatoes and vegetables that had been cooked with actual care. Kieran ate steadily and methodically, like it was a task to complete, while Natalie tried to make conversation about the ranch and the cattle and anything that might bridge the enormous silence between them. "You miss Philadelphia?" he asked suddenly, catching her off guard. "I miss what it used to be." She chose her words carefully. "Before my parents died, but what it became after that, no, I do not miss that at all," he nodded slowly. "Michael was the one who knew how to talk to people. He was good at all the things I am not." "Like what?" "Making friends. Making people laugh, making them feel comfortable." Kieran looked down at his plate. "I am better with the cattle." Despite herself, Natalie felt a flicker of sympathy for this hard man who clearly carried his brother's death like stones in his pockets. "I am not very good at those things either." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than resignation there. Something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The ride back to the ranch happened in darkness, under stars that were brighter and more numerous than anything Natalie had seen in her life. The sky felt close enough to touch, vast and overwhelming, and she found herself tipping her head back to stare at it even as the wagon bounced over the rough road. "Wait," Kieran said suddenly, pulling the horses to a stop. "What is wrong?" He was quiet for a moment, then he turned to her with an expression she could not quite read in the starlight. "I need to say something, and I am not good at this, so just let me get it out." Natalie's heart picked up speed. "All right. Catherine leaving, that was not about you. And me asking you here, that was not about settling for second best." His voice was rough with some emotion he was trying to control. "Truth is, I was relieved when she left. Grateful even though I felt guilty for feeling that way. We would have been miserable together, trying to be something we were not just because we thought we should. Then why did you still want a wife? Because this place is too damn big for one person." He gestured at the land around them, invisible in the darkness but present in every direction. "Because I come in at the end of the day, and there is nothing but silence and dust and the sound of my own thoughts. Because I am tired of being alone." The honesty in his words hit Natalie somewhere deep in her chest. "I understand that. What I am trying to say is, you are not nobody's second choice." His hand found hers in the darkness, rough and warm and solid. "Maybe you are exactly what I needed, and I was too stupid to know I needed it, until you stepped off that train looking like you were ready to fight the whole damn world if you had to. Natalie felt something crack open inside her, something she had kept carefully locked away for months. I thought you were disappointed when you saw me at the station. I was disappointed in myself for dragging someone into my mess, for not being the kind of man who could offer you anything better than this. He squeezed her hand gently. But when you looked at me with those fierce eyes and said you were a survivor, I thought maybe we might be all right. Maybe we might make something out of this that is better than what either of us had before. She did not trust herself to speak, so she just held his hand and looked up at the impossible stars. And for the first time since her parents died, she felt something that might have been hope. They started again when they got back to the ranch, standing in the main room with the lamp flickering between them. Kieran cleared his throat, suddenly awkward again. I do not expect anything tonight, or any night until you are ready. We can take this as slow as you need. Thank you. Natalie meant it, for being honest, for treating me like a person instead of a solution to a problem. You are a person, he said simply. A brave one coming all this way on nothing but faith and desperation. Mostly desperation, she admitted, still brave. He smiled then, just a small thing that softened his whole face and made her see what he might look like if he carried less weight on his shoulders. Good night, Natalie. Good night, Kieran. She went to her room and lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of this new life settling around her. The house creaking in the cooling night air. A coyote calling somewhere in the distance. The faint sound of Kieran moving around in his own room, preparing for sleep. She was married to a man she had met that morning, in a place so foreign it might as well be another country, and somehow she was not as terrified as she probably should have been. The next weeks passed in a blur of learning and adjusting. Natalie had expected to know nothing useful about ranch life, but Kieran was patient in his teaching, showing her how to care for the chickens, how to tend the vegetable garden that struggled in the harsh soil, how to cook the simple foods that sustained him. She learned that he rose before dawn every day, that he took his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, that he was quieter in the mornings until he had been awake for a few hours. She learned other things too. That he had nightmares sometimes, and she would hear him moving around the house at odd hours. That he read books in the evenings, mostly histories and agricultural journals, hunched over the pages like they held secrets. That he was meticulous about caring for the horses and cattle, checking each animal with a thoroughness that spoke of genuine concern for their well-being. He never pushed her or made demands. If anything, he was almost too careful around her, maintaining a distance that was respectful but also lonely. They worked side by side during the days and ate meals together in the evenings, and slowly, painfully slowly, they began to talk about things that mattered. "Tell me about your brother," Natalie said one evening after supper, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Kieran was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Michael was 3 years younger than me. He was supposed to be the one who went east for school, who made something of himself beyond this ranch. But he loved this land more than anything, and he could not stand to leave it. What happened? With the horse, I mean. He was breaking a young stallion, doing it alone because he was stubborn and thought he knew better." Kieran's voice was flat, emotionless. "The horse reared and came down wrong, threw Michael into the fence. He was dead before I found him an hour later. That was not your fault. I know that in my head." He touched his temple, but knowing something and believing it are different things. Natalie reached over and took his hand, the way he had taken hers that night under the stars. "He would not want you to carry that. He would not." Kieran looked at their joined hands. "But I do anyway." They sat like that as the darkness came on, hand in hand, and it felt like something significant was shifting between them, some wall slowly crumbling into understanding. In mid-June, a week of storms rolled through the territory, violent thunderstorms that turned the sky black and sent rain hammering down like bullets. The creek that ran through the southern part of Kieran's property flooded its banks, and they spent 2 frantic days moving cattle to higher ground, working until they were both soaked through and exhausted. Natalie learned that fear could be exhilarating when it was mixed with purpose, that her body was capable of more than she had ever asked of it, that Kieran trusted her to do what needed doing without constant supervision. She learned to ride properly during those days, sitting a horse while guiding stubborn cattle through mud and rising water, and she felt something fierce and proud kindling in her chest. On the second night, they came in drenched and shivering despite the warmth of the evening. Kieran immediately started a fire while Natalie changed into dry clothes. When she came back out, he had heated water for coffee and was stripping off his sodden shirt, revealing a lean, muscled back crisscrossed with old scars that spoke of a hard life lived in a hard place. He caught her looking and paused. "Sorry, I should have warned you." "About what?" "I am not pretty under the clothes." Natalie crossed the room and stood close enough to see the faint pink lines that marked him. "Neither is anyone who has actually lived. Who cares about pretty?" He turned to face her, and the expression on his face was raw and vulnerable in a way she had never seen from him. "You worked hard today, harder than I had any right to expect. I did what needed doing. You saved that calf that got stuck in the mud. If you had not been there, I would have lost it. So we saved it together." She was very aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his bare skin, of the way his eyes were locked on hers. "That is what partners do." "Partners," he repeated, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like the formal peck at their wedding. This was real and deep and full of all the things they had not known how to say to each other. Natalie felt herself melting into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where his heart was hammering against her palm. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I did not plan on it and I do not know how it happened, but there it is." Joy and terror flooded through Natalie in equal measure. "I am falling in love with you too, and it scares me." "Why?" "Because I could lose you the way I lost everything else." His arms came around her, solid and sure. "You could. That is how life works. But you could also not lose me. You could have 50 years with me if we are lucky, and would not that be worth the risk?" She thought about it, about all the ways a person could be hurt, about all the walls she had built to protect herself. Then she thought about this man who had been honest with her from the start, who had worked beside her and trusted her and let her see his scars, and she knew what her answer was. "Yes," she whispered. "It would be worth the risk." They made love that night with the storm still howling outside, learning each other's bodies with a mixture of tenderness and hunger that left them both breathless. Afterward, lying in Kieran's bed with his arms around her, Natalie felt safe in a way she had not felt since before her parents died. Safe and wanted and home. "You are nobody's second choice," Kieran murmured into her hair. "You are my first choice, my only choice, the best thing that ever happened to this ranch and to me." Natalie turned in his arms so she could see his face. "Say that again. You are nobody's second choice." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her mouth. "You are everything I did not know I was waiting for." She believed him. Summer deepened across New Mexico, bringing heat that shimmered off the red earth and turned the sky white at midday. Natalie learned to move through it, to work in the early mornings and late evenings, to rest during the brutal afternoon hours. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the constant cycle of work that kept everything running, and she found herself growing stronger, more capable, more confident in her place here. Kieran continued to surprise her. He was not naturally demonstrative, but he showed his affection in small, practical ways, fixing things in the house before she mentioned they were broken, making sure her favorite coffee cups were always clean, putting his hand on the small of her back when they walked together, teaching her to shoot, patient and calm even when she missed the target completely, his arms coming around her to adjust her stance until she finally hit what she was aiming at. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now you can protect yourself if you need to. From what? Aggressive bottles. From whatever." His expression turned serious. "This is not always a safe place, Natalie. I need to know you can handle yourself when I am not here." She understood what he was not saying, that the territory could be dangerous, that accidents happened, that he carried fear for her the way he had carried grief for his brother. So she practiced until she was competent, and she saw the relief in his eyes when she could hit the target more often than not. In July, they rode into Santa Fe for supplies and found the town buzzing with news. A group of rustlers had been hitting ranches to the south, making off with cattle and horses and leaving chaos in their wake. The sheriff was organizing a group to patrol the area, asking for volunteers from the local ranchers. Kieran signed up without hesitation, and Natalie felt ice form in her stomach. "How long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe 2. Depends on whether we catch them." He took her hand. "Frank and Roberto said they will check on you every day. You will not be alone." "I am not worried about being alone. I am worried about you getting hurt chasing criminals through the desert." His expression softened. "I will be careful, I promise." "You better be." She gripped his hand hard. "Because I did not come all this way to be a widow." He left 2 days later with a group of 8 men, all armed and grim-faced. Natalie watched him ride away and felt like part of her chest was leaving with him. She had known him for less than 2 months, but he had become essential to her in a way that defied logic or time. The house felt enormous and empty without him, too quiet except for the sounds of her own movement. She kept busy, throwing herself into the work that did not stop just because Kieran was gone. Frank and Roberto came by every day as promised, good men who treated her with respect and helped with the heavier tasks. But the nights were long and lonely, and Natalie found herself lying awake in Kieran's bed, breathing in the scent of him from the pillows and trying not to imagine all the terrible things that could happen out there in the vastness. He had been gone for 9 days when one of the horses came back riderless, wild-eyed and lathered with sweat. Natalie's heart stopped when she saw it galloping up to the barn, and she ran out to catch it, checking frantically for blood or any sign of what had happened. The horse was unharmed but terrified, and it took her an hour to calm it enough to unsaddle. She was standing in the yard, trying to decide what to do, when she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. She ran to get the rifle, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it, and positioned herself on the porch with the weapon ready. If the rustlers were coming here, she would not make it easy for them. But it was not rustlers. It was Kieran and 3 other men, riding slowly, carefully, with someone draped over one of the horses. Natalie set the rifle down and ran to meet them, her heart in her throat. "I am all right," Kieran called out when he saw her running. "Natalie, I am all right." She reached him and nearly dragged him off his horse, needing to touch him to confirm he was really there and whole. He dismounted and caught her, holding her tight while she shook against him. "What happened? Whose horse came back?" "Jenkins got shot." "He will be all right, but we needed to get him to the doctor in town fast, so we sent his horse ahead." Kieran stroked her hair. "I am sorry. We should have thought about what that would mean, you seeing the horse like that." "Did you catch them?" "We did." All 5 of them, and they are on their way to jail." He pulled back to look at her face. "It is over, Natalie. I am home." She kissed him there in front of the other men, not caring who saw, pouring all her fear and relief into it. When they broke apart, one of the men was grinning. "Looks like you got yourself a good one, Cole." "I know," Kieran said, not taking his eyes off Natalie. "Best decision I ever made." That night, after the other men had left and they had eaten and cleaned up, they lay together in the darkness and Kieran told her everything. The long days of tracking, the confrontation that had ended with gunfire and Jenkins taking a bullet to the shoulder, the capture and the long ride back. He told her about being scared, about thinking of her here alone, about wanting to get back to her more than he had wanted anything in a long time. "I kept thinking that I only got a few weeks with you," he said quietly, "and how unfair that would be to find something this good and lose it so fast. You did not lose it. You are here. I am here." He kissed her temple. "And I am not going anywhere if I can help it. No more volunteering for dangerous things unless there is no other choice." "Good." Natalie nestled closer to him. "Because I need you here. This place needs you, and I am not ready to run this ranch by myself. You could, though, if you had to. You are strong enough." "Maybe. But I would rather not find out." August brought different challenges. The heat intensified and water became a constant concern. Kieran spent long hours managing the irrigation for their small fields, and Natalie learned to conserve every drop in the house. They worked together to keep the garden alive, hauling water by hand when the creek ran low, and Natalie felt a fierce pride when she managed to coax tomatoes and squash from the stubborn earth. They were hauling water one afternoon when Natalie saw riders approaching from the east. Kieran straightened, shading his eyes with his hand, then relaxed slightly. "Neighbors. The Bradleys from the next property over." The Bradleys turned out to be a couple in their 50s, weathered and practical, with 4 grown sons who worked their ranch. Elizabeth Bradley looked Natalie over with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and Natalie prepared herself for judgment. "So you are the replacement bride," Elizabeth said bluntly. "I am Natalie Cole," she replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "Good for you." Elizabeth surprised her with a wide smile. "Takes guts to come out here on nothing but hope. I did the same thing 30 years ago, and I do not regret a day of it." They stayed for dinner, and Natalie found herself genuinely liking the older woman who was tough and funny and full of stories about the early days of the territory. Before they left, Elizabeth took Natalie aside. "Kieran is a good man, damaged by what happened with his brother, but good. You are what he needed, someone who does not have history with the ghosts he carries." She squeezed Natalie's hand. "And you needed someone who would not see you as second best. You two are good for each other." "How do you know?" "The way he looks at you when you are not watching." "Like you are water in the desert." Elizabeth smiled. "That is how you know it is real." In September, Kieran taught Natalie to really ride, not just the basic competence she had learned during the storms, but true skill. They spent hours in the early mornings with her learning to control the horse with subtle shifts of weight and pressure, to move with the animal instead of against it, to trust herself and her mount. There was something meditative about it, about the communication between human and horse that required patience and respect. "You are a natural," Kieran said one morning, watching her take a young mare through her paces. "Better than I was at this point." "You are just saying that because you love me." "I am saying it because it is true, and because I love you." He rode closer, his horse dancing sideways until they were knee to knee, but mostly because it is true. That afternoon, they rode out to the far edge of the property, to a place where the land rose into red rock formations that glowed in the afternoon light. Kieran had packed food in his saddlebag, and they ate sitting on a flat boulder, looking out over the land that stretched in every direction. "This is the place Michael loved most," Kieran said quietly. "He used to come up here when he needed to think. It is beautiful. It is." He was quiet for a moment. "I think he would have liked you, would have approved of this of us." Natalie leaned against his shoulder. "Tell me something about him that made you laugh." So Kieran told her stories, good ones, about the brother he had lost, about pranks and adventures and the kind of shared history that only siblings have. And for the first time, he talked about Michael without the weight of guilt crushing the words, and Natalie knew they were both healing, slowly but surely. October brought cooler weather, and the work of preparing for winter. They spent long days repairing fences, checking the condition of the barn, making sure everything was secure and ready for whatever weather the season might bring. Natalie learned to preserve food, to store vegetables, to do all the practical things that would keep them fed when the land was frozen. They were working in the barn one afternoon when Natalie suddenly felt dizzy. She sat down hard on a hay bale, and Kieran was beside her immediately, his face creased with concern. "What is wrong?" "I do not know. Just felt strange all of a sudden." The dizziness passed, leaving her feeling shaky but better. "I am all right now." But it happened again the next day and the day after that, always in the afternoons, always leaving her pale and clammy. Kieran finally insisted she see the doctor in Santa Fe, and they made the trip into town with him fretting the entire way. Dr. Harrison was a practical man in his 60s who examined Natalie thoroughly and then sat back with a knowing smile. "When was your last monthly?" Natalie thought about it, tried to count back, and felt her eyes go wide. "I think it has been 2 months. "That is what I thought." He looked between them. "Congratulations. You are going to have a baby." The ride back to the ranch passed in stunned silence. Natalie kept touching her stomach, trying to feel different, trying to imagine a person growing inside her. Kieran kept glancing at her, his expression cycling through shock and wonder and fear. When they finally reached the house, he helped her down from the wagon and then just stood there, holding her hands and looking at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. "A baby," he said softly. "Are you all right with this?" "All right," he laughed, and it was pure joy. "Natalie, I am more than all right. I am happy, scared out of my mind, but happy." "Me too." She pressed his hand to her stomach. "We made this together." "Together," he agreed. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and they were both laughing and crying at the same time because they had built something real here, something that was going to grow into the future. The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Kieran became even more protective, hovering until Natalie had to remind him that she was not made of glass. But she loved it too, loved the way he touched her stomach with a kind of reverence, the way he talked to the baby even though it was far too early for it to hear, the way he looked at her like she was performing some kind of miracle. Winter came gently to the territory that year, cool but not brutal, with occasional snows that dusted the red earth white and then melted away. They spent the long evenings by the fire, with Kieran reading aloud while Natalie sewed tiny clothes for a baby they had not yet met. Sometimes they talked about names, arguing good-naturedly about what they would call this person who would be half her and half him. "If it is a boy, what about Michael?" Natalie suggested one evening. Kieran was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel pressured." "I am sure. He was important to you and he is part of this story, part of how we got here. I think it would be good. And if it is a girl, something beautiful, something that means hope or new beginnings." They settled on Dawn if it was a girl, Michael if it was a boy, and Natalie felt content with those choices, felt like they were honoring the past while embracing the future. Christmas came and they celebrated quietly, just the two of them. Kieran had carved a small wooden horse for the baby, its lines simple and beautiful. And Natalie gave him a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had bought on one of their trips to town. They exchanged gifts and then made love in front of the fire, slow and tender, with Natalie's changing body cradled carefully in Kieran's arms. "Best Christmas I have ever had," he murmured afterward. "Me too. I love you, Natalie Cole, more than I thought I could love anyone. I love you too. And not just because you got me pregnant." He laughed against her hair. "Good to know I have other redeeming qualities." The new year of 1879 arrived with clear skies and the promise of change. Natalie's belly was growing steadily now, undeniable proof of the life they had created. She felt the baby move for the first time in late January, a flutter like butterfly wings, and she grabbed Kieran's hand and pressed it to the spot until he felt it too. His face lit up with such wonder that Natalie felt tears spring to her eyes. "That is our baby," he said, awed. "That is our baby," she confirmed. They were not just surviving anymore. They were thriving, building something that mattered, putting down roots in this hard land that had taken them both in and given them a chance to start over. Natalie thought often about the train ride that had brought her here, about how terrified and desperate she had been, and she could barely recognize that woman now in the person she had become. February brought colder weather and a heavy snowstorm that kept them housebound for 3 days. They used the time to finish preparations for the baby, setting up a cradle that Kieran had built in the corner of their bedroom, organizing the tiny clothes and blankets. Natalie was due in early April, and she found herself both excited and terrified about what was coming. "What if I am not good at this?" she asked one evening, lying in bed with Kieran's hand on her belly. "At being a mother, at all of it. What if I do not know what to do? Then you will figure it out the same way you figured out everything else since you got here." He kissed her shoulder. "And you will not be alone. I will be right there with you, equally confused and trying to figure it out. That is strangely comforting. I am full of strange comfort." March arrived with warming temperatures and the first hints of spring. Natalie's mobility was limited now by her size, but she still helped with what she could, refusing to be completely sidelined. Kieran fussed and worried, but he had learned when to push and when to let her make her own choices. Elizabeth Bradley came to visit, bringing advice and supplies and a no-nonsense attitude that Natalie found reassuring. "Your first is always the scariest, but women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and you are strong enough to handle it." "How do you know?" "Because you are still here, still working, still building a life in a place that does not make anything easy. That takes strength, girl. You will be fine." The baby came on a warm evening in early April, 3 days before Natalie's due date. Her water broke while she was fixing supper, and Kieran went pale and then immediately into action, riding for town to fetch Dr. Harrison while Elizabeth, who had providentially stopped by that afternoon, stayed with Natalie. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Natalie had never known pain like this, wave after wave of it that made her wonder if she would survive. But Elizabeth was there with cool cloths and encouragement, and when Dr. Harrison arrived, he took charge with calm competence. When Kieran finally came into the room, his face was streaked with tears, and he was holding the most beautiful thing Natalie had ever seen. A baby. Their baby. A son, red-faced and squalling, perfect in every way. "Michael," Kieran said softly, placing the baby in Natalie's arms. "Michael Kieran Cole." Natalie looked down at this tiny person they had made, this perfect combination of hope and love and the future, and she felt something break open in her chest. "Hello, Michael. We have been waiting for you." The baby quieted at her voice. his dark eyes opening to look at her with that unfocused newborn gaze. And Natalie fell completely, irrevocably in love. Those first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Michael was a healthy baby, strong, lunged, and hungry, and he kept them both up at all hours. Natalie learned to function on fragments of sleep, to nurse the baby while half asleep herself, to interpret the different cries that meant hungry or tired or uncomfortable. Kieran was a devoted father from the start, getting up with her at night, walking the floor with Michael when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. Watching him with their son, Natalie fell in love with him all over again, seeing this new side of the man she had married. "You are good at this," she told him one morning, watching him cradle Michael with practiced ease. "So are you. We are figuring it out together, just like everything else." He smiled at her over their son's head. "We make a good team." Spring deepened into summer, and life settled into new rhythms. The ranch work continued, but now it was punctuated by feeding times and naps and the constant awareness of this tiny person who depended on them completely. Natalie learned to work with the baby strapped to her body, Michael sleeping against her chest while she tended the garden or worked in the house. The neighbors came to visit, bringing gifts and congratulations. Frank and Roberto each presented the baby with small carved toys, their rough hands gentle as they held Michael. Elizabeth brought blankets and advice, and her fierce approval of the job they were doing. "You two have done well," she told them as she was leaving from one visit. "Built something real here. That is not easy in this country, but you made it happen." "We had help," Natalie said, "from you and everyone else who gave us a chance. We just recognized what was already there." Elizabeth smiled. "Now raise that boy right, and maybe he will grow up to be as good a man as his father." In August, when Michael was 4 months old and starting to laugh and respond to their voices, Kieran took Natalie and the baby up to the Red Rock Formation, where they had eaten lunch that day so many months ago. They spread a blanket and sat looking out over the land with Michael between them, his chubby hands grasping at everything in reach. "This is what Michael would have wanted," Kieran said quietly. "For this place to be full of life and hope again, for there to be a future here." "He has that," Natalie said, watching their son. "He has a nephew named after him and a family that loves him and a place in this story. Because of you. Because you came here even though you were scared. Because you gave me a reason to stop just surviving and start living." He took her hand. "You saved me, Natalie, in every way a person can be saved. You saved me too. You gave me a home and a future and love when I thought I would never have any of those things again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other." They sat there as the sun moved across the sky, painting the rocks in shades of gold and orange, and Natalie thought about the journey that had brought her here. The train that had carried her west on nothing but desperation and determination. The awkward meeting at the station. The wedding that had felt more like a business transaction than a celebration. All of it had led to this moment, to this family, to this life that was so much more than she had dared to hope for. Young Michael started to fuss, and Natalie picked him up, settling him to nurse while Kieran packed up their supplies. The baby's dark eyes, so much like his father's, looked up at her with perfect trust, and she felt her heart expand to accommodate even more love than she had thought possible. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, with Michael sleeping in Natalie's arms and Kieran riding close beside them, protective and content. When they got home, they worked together to settle the baby for the evening, moving through the familiar routine with the easy coordination of partners who knew each other well. That night, after Michael was asleep and the house was quiet, Kieran pulled Natalie out onto the porch. The stars were brilliant overhead, that same impossible sky that had awed her on her first night here, and she tipped her head back to look at them. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked. "That I am happy. Really, truly happy in a way I did not know existed." She turned to face him. "When I got on that train, I thought I was just trying to survive. I thought I was accepting second best because I had no other choice. And now I know that I was not settling at all. I was finding exactly what I needed, even though I did not know I needed it." She reached up to touch his face. "You told me I was nobody's second choice, and you were right. But what you did not tell me was that you were not a second choice either. You are my first choice, my best choice, the only choice that ever mattered." He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of all the love they had built together from nothing but honesty and hard work and hope. When they broke apart, they were both smiling. "Come to bed," he murmured. "Our son will be awake in a few hours demanding food, and we should sleep while we can." Practical as always. Someone in this marriage has to be. They went inside, closing the door on the vast New Mexico night, and Natalie felt nothing but contentment. This was her life now, these people were her family, and this place was her home. Not because she had settled or given up or accepted less than she deserved, but because she had been brave enough to take a chance on something uncertain and strong enough to build it into something real. The years that followed were full of the work and joy and occasional heartbreak that made up a life. Michael grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a boy who loved the ranch and the horses and following his father everywhere. Natalie and Kieran added 2 more children to their family. A daughter named Dawn who arrived in 1881 with her mother's fierce determination, and another son named Thomas who came in 1883 with his father's quiet strength. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Natalie proved to have a good head for the business side of things, keeping records and managing accounts, while Kieran focused on the cattle and land management. They made decisions together, argued when they disagreed, and always came back to the fundamental trust and respect that had been the foundation of their relationship from the start. They were not without challenges. There were years when the drought was bad and they worried about losing everything. Years when illness swept through the territory and they held their children close and prayed. Years when the isolation and hard work felt overwhelming. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. One evening in the spring of 1890, Natalie sat on the porch watching her 3 children play in the yard. Michael was 12 now, tall and serious, already helping with the ranch work in meaningful ways. Dawn was 9, wild and free as her name suggested, always climbing things she should not and asking questions that had no easy answers. Thomas was 7, quieter than his siblings but with a smile that could light up a room. Kieran came out and sat beside her, his hand finding hers automatically. They had been married for almost 12 years, and he was still the first person she wanted to talk to, the one she reached for in the darkness, the one who knew her better than anyone. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the same question he had asked her hundreds of times over the years. "That I love this life. Even the hard parts, even the days when everything goes wrong, I love it." She squeezed his hand. "And I love you for giving it to me. You gave it to yourself. You were the one who got on that train. You were the one who chose to stay even when it was hard." He smiled at her. "I was just lucky enough to be here when you arrived. Remember what you said to me? On the wagon going into town, I said a lot of things. You said I was nobody's second choice." The memory was still clear, still powerful after all these years. "That was the moment I started to fall in love with you." "Took you that long?" He was teasing, but his eyes were serious. "I started falling the moment you stepped off that train looking like you were ready to take on the world. I was terrified. I know. That is what made it so brave. They sat together as the sun set, painting the New Mexico sky in the colors they had learned to love, while their children played and the ranch hummed with life around them. This was the life Natalie had built from desperation and determination, from hope and hard work, from love that had started as necessity and grown into something that sustained them both. She was nobody's second choice. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with, living a life she had earned through courage and strength, and the willingness to take a chance on a stranger in a strange land. And every day she was grateful for the train that had brought her west, for the cowboy who had seen her value when she doubted it herself, and for the family they had built together in this beautiful, harsh, generous place they called home. Michael called out, something about a lizard he had found, and Dawn was demanding to see it while Thomas hung back, cautious as always. Kieran stood to go referee whatever dispute was brewing, and Natalie followed, ready to join in the chaos and love of their everyday life. This was not the ending she had imagined when she was that frightened young woman on the train. It was better. It was real. It was hers. And as she watched her husband lift their youngest into his arms and explain something about the lizard to all three children, as she felt the warm New Mexico sun on her face and heard the laughter of her family, Natalie knew that she had found exactly what she had been searching for, even when she had not known what that was. She had found home. She had found love. She had found herself, and she had never been anyone's second choice at all.